Welcome, everyone. We're just letting people in from the waiting room now. Welcome. As you're getting settled in, feel free to use the chat box and you can introduce yourself and say where you're calling in from. And perhaps what interested you in today's webinar? What's your interest in this topic? Welcome, everybody. For people just joining, we're just letting people in from the waiting room right now. You can use the chat box, introduce yourself, say where you're calling in from, and get settled in, and we'll be starting in a minute or so. Alrighty, I think we can get started. So before we get into the content, I'll just say a few Zoom housekeeping items. Today's event will run for about 1 hour and we are recording the webinar. So if you have to leave at any time or if you want to share this with your friends or networks, we will send out the recording afterwards. And please use the chat box throughout the event to post your comments, your questions. If you haven't yet, you can post your introduction there now. We do have closed captions enabled for today's event. You can click on the CC live transcript button, which is usually towards the right-hand side of your Zoom screen, and there you can enable captions if you'd like to view them. Sometimes you have to click the 3 dots and then you'll see more options and then you'll see the captions. And a reminder that the captions are done by robots, so please excuse any errors with the transcription. And with that, I will pass it over to Larry Gilbert, a co-coordinator of the World Beyond War Florida chapter, to introduce today's event. Larry, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hang on. Oh. Okay, here I am. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of us here on the East Coast of the US, I'm currently in Florida. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you the gentleman that I admire for his work and just a wonderful person. Sam Bahour is an American-Palestinian writer and management consultant living in Ramallah in the West Bank in Palestine. He is co-founder and emeritus member of Americans for a Vibrant Palestinian economy and currently serves as an independent director at the Arab Islamic Bank, PLC, and a board member of Just Vision. And Just Vision, we here showed the film Boycott. So we're very familiar with Just Vision. So without any further ado, I present to you Sam Bahour.
Thank you, Larry, Greta, and everyone for joining. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's great to see so many familiar names participating. Before I start, I want to thank the 3 organizers of this event, Partners for Palestine, World Beyond War, and Veterans for Peace. Thank you for all you do, not only for Palestine, but for other areas of the world as well. And also, Larry, thank you guys for showing Boycott. It's a critical documentary to be shown to a US audience. So if anyone has not seen it, it has started to stream since March 1st. So anyone can watch it online at their leisure. I've been asked to speak about the concept of Confederation, something that was brought to the attention of the organizers via a op-ed that an Israeli writing partner and myself had published a couple years ago in the New York Times. And the title of today's talk is the same title as that article, which is Want Israeli-Palestinian Peace, Try Confederation. I usually don't use slides, but since I was asked to do slides, I'm glad I was asked because it allowed me to create a beginning of something that I would develop over time. I have a few slides to just conceptualize where we're talking about and what we're talking about. And I'll get to the end of this quickly so we can actually open it up for conversation, which I think is the more valuable part of any of these webinars. So if I wanted to start here, I would start with the geographical context. This is a map of the Middle East for the most part. And what we're talking about, I don't know if you can see my cursor. We're talking about on the left-hand side of the map, okay, this orange dot right here is the Gaza Strip, this orange strip, and this orange part here is Palestine. The blue part is Israel. So we're talking about this area, and if you put it into context of the region, you can start to see how small of an area that we're actually contemplating for this long period of time. To bring it home a little bit more for our US audience, you know, of course, that New York is organized around boroughs. If you take one borough, the largest one, the Queens borough, we're talking about the Gaza Strip being the size of Queens. Not the city of New York, not the state of New York, but a borough in the city of New York. If you take the West Bank, this larger orange area, we're talking about nearly two times the size of Queens. To give perspective, if we talk about the entire area, we're talking about less than the New York City. So you're talking about a very small area that has received all this attention over the years. If I take, just to give another example here, if I take today's budget of Queens, the borough, it's around $6.65 million a year. If I times that 56 years, which is the amount of time that we've been under military occupation, that's less than $1 billion. If you take the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza Strip, and you see how much money that the donor community has pumped in to this area since 1993, it's over $40 billion. Yet they're not able to make the positive impact that was desired in all of that time of the last 2 decades, basically. So it's very, very crucial to understand that we're talking about a very small geographic location. If we start prior to 1948, I don't like to start with 1948 because it's become the landmark date. And some people have believed in their minds that history started here with the creation of the state of Israel. That is not true. There was a thriving community here prior to 1948. I pulled this map specifically, which shows the districts of historic Palestine, the British mandated Palestine, prior to 48. This one happens to be from 1946. And I put the source as well, because if you go to the source, you'll be able to click on any of these districts, which we today call governance, and you can go into detail of not only the cities and villages that are inside these districts, but what were their, what did their economy look like, what sectors of trade did they have, and so forth. Very, very interesting place to dig a little bit deeper. But the starting point for me is that there was a Palestine before 48. And the other message I'd like to get across is that Palestinians did not get up one day and go look for a fight. This conflict came to them. We were sitting in our homes and something came to us. That's also an important starting point for us to keep in mind. If I go forward one step, as the crisis began, the United Nations took note that there's a problem, and the British mandate was about to exit. They did not achieve their goal of getting the Palestinians to reach statehood, and they were going to prematurely leave the British mandated area that they were assigned. The United Nations passed the General Assembly resolution, Resolution 181 in 1947. I should note, General Assembly resolutions are non-binding resolutions. So that's an important starting point. This is not something that the UN says and it's set in stone. This is more of a recommendation that the General Assembly makes to the members of the UN. Today, over time, hundreds of UN resolutions have been taken, which actually embed and enshrine a two-state reality, at least in the books. And we should note as well, when this two-state arrangement was configured in the map that's here, the UN said one state, the yellow part will be Jewish, and the gray part will be Arab. They did not define Jewish, they did not define Arab. So I'm not a legal person, but for me, if you don't define a term, it's almost irrelevant in the text. Does Jewish mean Jews from Youngstown, Ohio can come and just live here? Or does Arab mean a Saudi Arabian can pick up and come and live in Palestine and say, well, it was an Arab state? I don't believe that's what they had in mind. There's a whole context to how the UN resolution was configured. It's a very interesting weekend read if you actually read the text of the resolution itself. But this is the first place that two states became codified in international law. Moving forward, of course, we know that there was a war in 1948, and Israel, by force, acquired more land than what was allocated to them in this suggested General Assembly resolution. That's important because if we respect the UN Charter, land acquired by force is inadmissible in international law. That's a very important concept. Because if you go from this map to this map, probably half, if not more, of Israel was acquired by force. So if we're respecting international law, we need to pull into question what that means. Another point I would make about this map is that the state of Palestine, which is the occupied Palestinian territory, the area in gray, and the state of Israel are the areas today that are viewed as the demarcation of the two states. Both sides lack one very important border, which is the border that they share. So Israel does not have defined borders. It has partially defined borders, but the border with the West Bank is not defined. And the Palestinians have declared their statehood, but they also left open how exactly the border to the west with Israel will be defined. So this is the map that we have kind of today. If we move forward one more step, if we take the beginning of the Oslo process, which the map looked like this, the gray part being the occupied territory, and we move fast forward till today, we can see these orange parts are the areas that have been forcefully fragmented by the force of the Israeli military and the Israeli government, basically resulting in a deteriorating occupied territory in terms of geography. The result of bilateral negotiations called the Oslo Accords, which were monopolized by the US, even though they were conceived in Oslo, but the US forced itself on the process and made sure no one else had a say in how this 20, 25 years of negotiations would happen, have resulted into more and more Israeli settlements being built, as well as more and more forced fragmentation. I would note here, if you want the details of that orange part, there is a UN organization on the ground here called OSHA, the it's the Office of Human Rights, I believe. I can put the link in the chat. They have very dynamic maps that go to every layer that is in that orange part. So it starts with the occupied territory, which was the slide before this, and it starts to add layer upon layer. The layer of settlements, the layer of the road networks, the layer of the checkpoints, et cetera, until you get something similar to this, which is a very fragmented and geographically not territorial connections between the different areas. So just to recap, we should note that impunity comes with a cost. If you're not holding Israel accountable, then the sheer fact that as you move from the left of this screen to the right of this screen is a free hand for Israel to continue to take more land, to take more decisions to build more settlements, and every settlement that gets created creates a more difficult reality on the ground. And I always point to Chris Hedges' quote, which I think is very powerful. We can talk about hope, but we can't really talk about it until we realize what reality looks like. And reality today has a very big sign on it, which says, impunity, continued impunity, you will not be left with anything to negotiate if this continues as it's currently moving, which is more Israeli land acquisition by force or settlement. I put up this slide because I don't want anyone to think that there's any illusions that we have, or I have, that the entire model of two states is alive and well. It's not well. I believe it may be still alive. The former Shin Bet chief doesn't believe that. Yevold Diskin, he actually wrote, and this is shocking because he wrote it back in 2013 in an Israeli English newspaper called Jerusalem Post. I won't read it all, but the first sentence, we are approaching a point of no return regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In fact, it may be that we have already crossed it. He's speaking of two states. There may not be an ability on the ground to, as is frequently referred to, unscrambling the omelet, because the two states are like two eggs. But if you make an omelet out of it and create one state, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to put the eggs back together again. It's up for debate if we've crossed that line or not, but for an Israeli security person to be saying that back in 2013, and all we've seen since 2013 is more right-wing Israeli governments with more settlement building. So we can only imagine the state of affairs today. So I start here with, in presenting the concept of confederation, with some assumptions, because we need to start with assumptions. There's too many moving parts just to absorb them all in one discussion. So these are my assumptions as a way forward. Number one, international law, not a US dictated rules-based order, is the reference. There's a lot being written about this today. The United States has introduced new language in the discourse, especially as it relates to Ukraine and Russia, and they talk about a rules-based order. Whereas up before that introduction, the reference point was clear. It's international law, it's codified, we can read it, we can understand it. And there's experts who study international law. But if it's rules-based, who's making the rules? And what happens if you break the rules? So I don't really adopt this rules-based fuzzy order. I remain committed to international law, which is the gold chip in being able to hold people accountable. My second assumption is Palestinian and Israeli people are not going to disappear. This is actually something that was documented and stated by Edward Said, one of the leading Palestinian intellectuals. He's since passed away. But this is something that when emotions are high, people would love the other side to disappear. I would rather speak of reality. Nobody's going anywhere. So we have to find a way to constructively move together forward. The next assumption is the issue of two states, and this is a big discussion these days. For me, it's already a decided fact. And it was, as I noted previously, codified by the request of the Palestinian Political Agency, the PLO, in a United Nations General Assembly resolution on November 29th, 2012. The Palestinians, when Oslo failed to end the conflict, the Palestinians brought a resolution to the General Assembly, the most multilateral body in the world, and said, General Assembly, i.e. world, we failed to bilaterally negotiate to end this conflict. So we're asking you is Palestine worthy of membership in the UN or not? And the majority of the countries of the world said yes, about 138. Now it's up to 140, I think, said yes to Palestine. And that allowed us to enter the UN as a non-member observer state, just like the Vatican is today. The other assumption, I'm living this every day, so I can speak a whole talk just about this sentence. The situation on the ground is deteriorating at a pace that is taking us to another full-scale violence, a round of violence. This has already begun. We are estimating at averaging about a death every other day, sometimes 4 and 5 in one day. This is going out of control in a way that we have not seen before. And we're not only talking about deaths here, we're talking about settler violence, which is the highest it's ever been. As well, we talk about punitive measures that the Israeli occupation takes, like arresting people, many without charge, the highest numbers we've ever seen, house demolitions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This reality actually should be the wake-up call for everyone working on this issue to understand that this is not a sports game that we can keep talking about forever. This is an urgent international crisis that requires immediate high-level intervention at all levels in all sectors, civil society, government, and the private sector. Another assumption is that internally, inside Palestine, surprise, surprise, we have domestic politics like every other people in the world. It has also entered a very dangerous phase. We have a very autocratic leadership, which is not allowing elections to take place and has damaged the independence of our judiciary. Our education, healthcare, and economics have all been damaged, partly due to the Israeli military occupation, this prolonged, sustained attack on us, but partly as well because of the incompetence, the corruption, and the inability for us to renew our political system and have new blood with new ideas to be able to face this. This is also for us Palestinians a high demand for immediate intervention. Lastly, if we look at successive US administrations, why US administrations? Because the US has an overly apparent role in this conflict because it has become the entity in the world that protects Israel from accountability. And it is, today, I do not call this the Israeli military occupation. I've started to call this the US-Israeli military occupation. The US is a full partner with Israel in maintaining this system of oppression, which we would call apartheid today. I believe that the fiasco of successive US administrations, I'm not only talking about the Trump period or the Biden period, I'm talking historically, US administrations have continually failed in trying to influence the parties to move forward because, as many US officials say after they leave office, the US is basically playing the lawyer of Israel, trying to protect Israel from the international community's will. I believe that successive US administrations' failure, given the reality of the deteriorating situation today, is an opportunity, especially from the grassroots, the church communities, the business communities, to influence their governments to say, hey, this is going to explode in our face yet again. It's time that we do something differently. And I hope that would be an impetus for us to move forward on a new model of thinking. So those are my assumptions. I also have some personal convictions that gets me convinced that I want to produce a thought process that allows us to think constructively. Even though today on the ground, many of my Palestinian neighbors would laugh at me thinking about a constructive joint future with the Israeli side, because things are so tense and emotionally high right now, people cannot see past the next incursion or the next house demolition. I try to see past that. What are my driving convictions? Number one, illegality will not be accepted. Yes, I'm looking for how we can create a joint future forward, But I will not accept an illegal reality to be legal in order for us to say, let's start from today. And the picture that I have here is an interesting one. It reflects that statement. What you're seeing is the Moroccan quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. A few hours after Israel occupied East Jerusalem and the old city, they demolished that Moroccan quarter of housing. And what you know that today to look like is the Temple Mount Plaza. That was not a plaza, that was houses of Palestinians who were living there. And actually one woman refused to leave and she was killed as the bulldozers brought down those houses. So I cannot accept that as not something that will be held accountable for as we find a way forward. My second driving conviction is that there is no military solution to this conflict. One side can't win no matter how much of a military might they have become. That's Israel. They can get nuclear weapons. They can have all the technology in the world. They can have a free hand to use it at will. They still can't win. That has been proven. And the other side, us Palestinians, we don't know how to lose. We understand how to be steadfast. The justice of our cause is so deep. That is what holds us from year to year. Definitely, it's not our great leadership. Definitely, it's not the international community coming to our savior. It's the Palestinians saying, we're not budging. We have a just cause. There was a wrong that was done to us, and we're going to stand firm. That doesn't mean we know how to win. It means we don't know how to lose. To be able to win, I think we need a model like I'm going to present, something that shows that there's an interest in both sides to work together. Another conviction that I base my thinking on is that the Palestinians will accept no less than an independent and sovereign state. That is how the Palestinian Political Agency, the PLO, has defined its self-determination. It's been defined in statehood. That state will either be from the river to the sea, all of historic Palestine reconstituted, or it will be what the PLO, the Palestinian Political Agency, has accepted to date. To date is important here, because if we have new elections and if we have a new leadership, they may decide to redefine our self-determination back to what it started with, which is a Palestine from the river to the sea. Another reason for Israelis to understand that this is maybe the last hour in this round, which will allow them to realize a Palestinian state next to Israel. If they don't take that opportunity, which is a very generous opportunity the Palestinians are giving them, they may be faced with a Palestinian leadership which formally says, our state is from the river to the sea. That will be a very different game. Lastly, without military occupation, I and many of my Israeli and Palestinian friends understand very, very clearly that there is much more in common between the two peoples, Palestinians and Israelis, than most people can imagine. What you see on your nightly news, the blood basically every day, that is one element of a very, very large mosaic of Palestine and Israel. The majority of that mosaic are things that we have in common, things that we can work together on for the interest of both parties. And with that, I enter into the concept of confederation. And in the simplest way I know how to put it, for me, in a nutshell, first I must note confederation is not a new concept. It's not a concept that Bernard Avishai and myself invented, although our articulation of a confederation is a very nuanced confederation. There are many, many flavors of confederation being worked on with different entities. Ours is only an article. It's not a full-fledged plan, but it does have a nuance that I think is worthy of taking note of. And I'm going to talk about a few of those right now. What is confederation? It's a model for the implementation of two states. It's not saying two states is dead, let's create a one state. It's not saying let's create three states, with Gaza being the third. It's saying a two-state solution, as embedded in international law, has had a hard time getting its message across. We believe partly because those who have been holding the mantra of two states have not articulated it in a way that both sides, especially the Israeli side, can see that there is an interest for them to adopt a two-state solution in a way which is feasible and practical, and not this hardcore thinking that there's two states with a 10-meter wall in between the two sides. It is a framework to get both sides on a track of constructive engagement for a joint future. Note the messaging here. It gets us on track. I, for one, do not believe that there is a push button that if we can only find it and press the button, we have a resolution to the conflict. Resolving this is going to be a process, and we have to get on the right track today and start making movement today on an end game that we define collectively. That's what the Oslo Accords failed to do. It failed to define an end game of a Palestinian state emerging from the negotiations. So the Israelis took that to the extreme and said, well, if it doesn't say Palestinian state, then we should be able to build settlements anywhere we want. That was a fault of Oslo. We need to correct that by setting the end game and working backwards. And the way I like to articulate it is as a wedding contract. When two mature adults marry, they are full-fledged individuals. One likes ice cream, the other likes bananas. It doesn't matter. They can still get married because they have more in common than ice cream and bananas that separates them. So they agree to work together on what they can work together on, and there has to be a bare minimum, of course. And they agree to disagree on all the other things that they want to keep in their individual lifestyles. I envision a confederation in the same manner. It is two independent states recognized in the world equally that decide voluntarily to come into a contractual agreement. As I noted in the previous slide, I think that contractual agreement will be very colorful and full of positive things that we can jointly work on. But there are things that we're not going to agree on. We want our state to have its own legislative body. The Israelis want their own legislative body. We want Arabic to be our national language. They may want Hebrew as their national language. And it applies to religion, it applies to policing, it applies to education system. There are many, many things that each country will want to keep in its own domain, but that doesn't mean that there are hundreds of other elements of society that can't be worked on together. And the most recent example, which was forced on us to work together on, is the pandemic. The pandemic, Corona didn't know where the green line was. So we had to work together to try to maintain some kind of addressing of the pandemic. That's one quick example, but I'm sure there's hundreds of others. Ultimately, Bernie and I wrote actually in The Guardian back in 2014, an article called Independence and Interdependence. We believe that there are no countries in the world today, including the US, that is fully independent. That word independent, when you talk about states today, needs to be analyzed. Because when you become a state, you sign on to the United Nations, you become a member of the United Nations, and by doing that, you sign on to a plethora of treaties and conventions and international law. And the example I like to give is when you send me from Florida a postcard, how does it get to me? That's amazing how it gets to me. Well, it gets to me because the US and the Palestinian side and all of the states in between sign on to an international convention that's managed by the International Postal Union that allows that piece of mail to move through the global postal system. So we need to keep in mind that international law is not only the Security Council and General Assembly. International law is apparent in almost every sphere of life. Water, frequencies, mail, airwaves, airline traffic control, you name it. International law imposes on member states to adopt the system that's in play. Otherwise, planes would hit each other, postal mail would get lost, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a contractual relationship between two sides voluntarily wanting to work together. If it doesn't work out, like some marriages don't work out, then each side can fall back on their individual person without going back to war. And the same thing would apply here. So international law in our thinking is key. There's no mistake that 70% of the United Nations has already recognized Palestine. The mass majority, if not more than 70%, has actually acknowledged that the military occupation must end and that refugees must have justice. Of course, Israelis have interests as well. They want their security, they want their economic achievement. Today, I would add to that, they want their democracy as well, because that's being eaten away internally with Israeli internal dynamics. So we need to preserve our national, political, and cultural distinction. But again, international law and our interests should create a long list of things that would allow us to work together. One of the hot spots or hot topics in any talk of a joint future is Jerusalem and borders. We articulated in our article that we believe if a confederal agreement was reached, a contractual agreement was reached, then Jerusalem and the borders would not be the hardest thing to resolve, because both sides would have their capital in Jerusalem as defined by international law, but both sides have an interest to keep the border porous, open, not a wall between the two sides, because the tourist who comes from Israel wants to cross over to the old city. And the tourist who comes into Palestine from Jericho wants to go visit not only the old city, but wants to continue on to Israel to go to Nazareth. So there's an interest, an economic interest for one, to have the area to be porous in terms of borders, even if the sovereignty is divided between two states. And that's similar to that the contractual arrangement I was speaking about in terms of marriage. So the marriage partners can agree. On Mondays and Fridays, the male is going to take out the garbage. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, the female is going to do the dishes. There's an agreement on issues and chores, and we need an agreement on the hot issues that we deal with. Lastly, on Confederation, Palestinian refugees does not fall into the same sentence for me as Israeli settlers. Those are very two different concepts. I do not speak of them in one breath. As for Palestinian refugees, they were made refugees when the state of Israel was created. We just commemorated 75 years of their dispossession. That body of refugees, that community of refugees, is living in the region, mainly in Lebanon, in Syria, what's left of Syria, Jordan, some in Egypt, and a lot are in the Gaza Strip. That community of refugees has rights in international law that have been enshrined in international law. One of those rights is the right to go back home. Regardless of how this is going to be politically resolved, every single day we should be reminding the Israelis that refugees have a right to go back home today. It doesn't have to wait until there's some kind of political resolution or political framework that the two sides agree to. That's the Palestinian refugees. We also have another hard issue to deal with, which are 700,000 Israeli settlers. And here I go back to one of my driving principles, is I don't accept illegality. So if you come into my house and rob me and put me in my bedroom and take over the rest of my house for 56 years, I will never accept that you come to my door and say, listen, let's just allow me to have the rest of the house, you can have the bedroom, and let's kiss and make up. That doesn't work in real life. It doesn't work in politics. Israeli settlers, every single one of them, whether they live in the big settlements called cities today in Israeli terminology, or in Israeli terminology, if they are in illegal, quote unquote, using Israeli legal terminology, outposts, which means like one container placed on a mountaintop that even Israel doesn't accept, that is illegal. And the bigger settlements, which have been identified in the Israeli system as cities like Modeh Adumim, are illegal under international law. Palestinians have zero responsibility to entertain that illegality. Having said that, in the confederal model, we feel it can address both of those two very different topics. Palestinian refugees should and could be able to come back home to Israel if they desire. Not all of them will desire to come live in a Hebrew-speaking state, but those who do have the right to, and they would be able to come back into Israel to live, but they can be citizens of the state of Palestine. They don't necessarily need to be citizens of the state of Israel. They can be residents of the state of Israel. And if the Palestinian government accepts Jewish Israeli citizens, not Israeli settlers, because that will not exist as a term anymore, but if there are Jewish Israeli citizens that have a high desire to live in the state of Palestine, Palestinians can have an immigration policy that allow them to apply and can have residency in Palestine, not in illegal settlements, but in Palestine, and be citizens of their country, Israel. And this is how we envision how a confederal agreement might be able to address that hard topic. 3 more slides and I'll be done here. So that's confederation. And what I'm being told, and a lot of people are responding to me these days, that can't happen. Sam, you're not listening to the nightly news. Don't you see where Israel is today? Accumulatively over the years, they've continued to say no Israeli state, publicly they say that, no equal rights. Basically, they've created for Palestinians 3 predefined paths. Path number 1, leave. They forced us out in 1948. They forced us out in 1967. Today, it's a little bit more difficult to put people on buses or open the borders and force them to walk across. So today, they get people to leave by strangulating the society, by fragmenting the communities, by making life living hell. And if I say that living in the West Bank, times 1,000, you get a feel for what it feels like in the Gaza Strip, where if the doors of the Gaza Strip would open today, I assume 90% of the Gazans would want to leave. So leaving is a strategy that the Israelis have predefined, and it's their preferred strategy. Second strategy is, if you don't leave, be a good Palestinian, don't call for rights and things like that, but if you're a good Palestinian, we'll give you a permit, an Israeli military permit, so you can wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, cross the checkpoint, come into Israel, work a whole day in Israel, in agriculture, in construction, even in software development today, and then go back at night to the house, your house in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, and be a day worker. And then repeat that for the rest of your life. If you don't leave, and you don't become a day worker for the sake of developing the Israeli economy, they would like us to turn violent. And the violence that they introduce to us every single day is overwhelming. I don't have time here to get into it, but I put this slide up just to remind us. I won't go through it all, but I can send it to people who want it. It's actually on my Facebook page that you can see it. Previous Israeli governments, this is not the worst Israeli government that we've seen. Previous Israeli governments dispossessed Palestinians, created a refugee community, refused internally to place Palestinians inside Israel from returning home, created the occupation, created the settlement enterprises, sealed off the Gaza Strip, bombed the Gaza Strip every few years, on and on and on. The list is very, very long. This is a continuation of what previous Israeli governments have done. There is a difference. The difference, it's a much more accelerated pace. And if we add to it the internal Israeli dynamics, the settler community, which has hijacked the Israeli political system, is entering into Israel proper and trying to damage the social fabric and the political fabric, i.e. democracy, of the state itself. So this monster that the Israelis created called the settlement community, this illegal settlement community, has come home and now is dealing in the same way that they deal with Palestinians, a lawless community, with the Israeli public itself. And lastly, I would note, without accountability, no framework, not confederation, not one state, not two state, not federation, not parallel sovereignty. I don't know why they call it political science. They should have called it political art. There are many possible frameworks. None of them will work if accountability is not part of the equation starting from today. And when I say accountability, I'm talking about holding both sides accountable, not only the Israeli side, but also because I respect international law, and it's one of my motivating convictions. International law has a very key principle embedded within it, which is the law of proportionality. Proportionality. So you are held accountable to the proportion of your crime. And I think if you take 75 years of dispossession, 56 years of military occupation, Israel should be worrying if the world gets the ability to actually hold them accountable. Lastly, for me, confederation is a language. It is a vision to call Israel's political bluff. I don't believe in Israel you have a political party that has any intention whatsoever to allow a political state to emerge as per defined by international law. So when I talk about confederation, I want to jump over the Israeli leadership and talk to the Israeli people and tell the Israeli people, Israeli citizens, we have a joint future together. Don't let your leadership create fear into you to the point where you're dehumanizing Palestinians. Having said that, stopping human rights abuses today requires no call, requires no framework. We already have a framework of international law. We need to be able to hold and stop these human rights abuses today. And that's something I should be able to agree with everybody who is a decent human being in this world, to put our hands together to tell Israel, stop the human rights abuses. To put our hands together and tell those forces in Gaza, you can't keep throwing indiscriminate rockets into the state of Israel. Those are two wrong acts, and we start holding the parties accountable. And with that, I will stop. I hope I didn't speak too long. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was incredibly informative. Thank you. We have a few questions that have been coming in. We have about 10-15 minutes more to get through them. The first question I have here is from Larry Berman, one of the members of the Florida World Beyond War chapter. And Larry says, how much does religion and religious beliefs prevent a problem for your concept of a future confederation?
Excellent question. One thing to remember, we are in a political conflict par excellence. That's how it has always been defined. Until recently, the last 10 to 15 years of a Netanyahu-led Israel has been pushing the discourse into a religious conflict, using Jerusalem as the hotspot because they know going to Jerusalem, violating the sanctity of the Dome of the Rock, and that will create a crisis in 1 second. And this Israeli right-wing government, last couple governments, have started to move into pushing that button of religion to be able to create a smokescreen to hide behind so they don't have to deal with the politics. I believe this is a political conflict. Of course, religion has a role in the discussion and the context of our discussions, but confederation to me does not disturb anyone's religious beliefs or atheist beliefs for that matter. You can be whatever you want to be in the citizen of your state, but you can't force upon someone else to be what you are. And that's what we're seeing today. not only as it applies to Palestinians, but within the state of Israel today, you have this right-wing settler-led government of Israel trying to tell Israeli citizens themselves that you have to be a specific flavor of Jews to be able to be accepted in the state of Israel. And that's what's creating a lot of havoc with Jewish Americans who are saying, hey, wait a second. Why are you excluding Reform Judaism, for example, from its full rights of being a Jew? And that's an internal debate. It is, for me, a smokescreen. It does not affect my ability to envision a confederation, which is a political resolution and not a religious configuration.
Thank you. We also have some questions that came in from Al. And Al, you can just go ahead and unmute if you'd like. Al is one of the founders of the Florida chapter, although now managing a chapter in Illinois. Al, go ahead.
Well, I had two questions, I think. The first one was, what is the definition of international law? And so could you, or what your definition of international law is?
It is not my definition. It is a definition enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and the bodies of the United Nations. So when I mentioned, for example, the International Postal Union, that's an organ of international law. It has its rules and regulations, just like the International Telecommunications Union, just like the International Aviation, I don't know what they call it. Each of those have bylaws and rules and how you become a member, because even if you're a member in the United Nations, you have to apply for membership in those organs of the UN, like UNESCO and UNICEF and all of those. So each of those have documented rules and regulations. To me, collectively, and UN Security Council resolutions and General Assembly resolutions and the Human Rights Council all become a body of international law. And people go 4 years to a university just to study international law. It's not something they're pulling out of a hat. It's something they're reading, which is codified. It may not be prescriptive in all fashion. It's not like the speed limit law, where if you go past 7, you get a ticket. Some of international law are principles that have to be interpreted. But there is consensus on most of these issues. And interestingly, we've been making a case for international law for decades. When Russia entered Ukraine, all of a sudden the American administration is even talking about international law. And we were like, sad for Ukraine, but great that the US is now promoting international law. Now, if we can only get them to stop the hypocrisy and start applying it to Palestine like they're applying it to Russia.
And then thank you. And my second question was, is Israel kind of looking at this like the US looked at how we treated the indigenous people in this continent? And we came in, took their land, but we made all these glorious treaties with them, and then violated those, consistently violated those treaties, took over the land, and now 100 years later, there's no way we're going to give up the land that we now own and control and call our home. And will that happen in Israel?
You are absolutely right. And when I hear US lawmakers talk about the shared values with Israel, that is the real shared value. That both of them have displaced an indigenous population. In the US case, it's much matured, it's developed, it's 200 years into the process. On the Israeli side, they can't wait to get 200 years into the process. The problem is the Palestinians are not buckling as quick as they would like us to. They have not, in a way, they've put us into Bantustans, which can be called Indian reservations if you'd like. And instead of casinos, they're trying to give a 21st century style to their approach by saying, you don't have a political conflict, you just need better economy, better companies, you'll do fine. And the Palestinians continuously say, no, that's a given. What we need is political independence and the boot of occupation removed from our neck, because we're not dropping our right to self-determination. And I would go back as well to the time of slavery in the US. I had a meeting last week, I had dinner with Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he was here visiting for the first time. And after 4 days of traveling and seeing firsthand this occupation, the first thing he said when we sat down, this is slavery in a different format. And I told him, I don't know what else I can tell you. You got it. You got it from seeing it. So yes, that is the shared value. Definitely when lawmakers in the US are talking about shared values, they must be deaf, dumb, and blind if they think Americans believe that the shared value with Israel is maintaining a military occupation, demolishing homes, killing children, imprisoning people without charge. There's no shared values between the American people and Israelis there. So if we want shared values, we need to be holding Israel accountable to come in line with what we believe are American values that are universal in fashion.
We're getting close to the end of the hour, but I had a question for you, Sam, which is, one of the things that we struggle with is how to get our message of peace into the mainstream media. And so I was pleasantly surprised to see that your, opinion piece was in the New York Times. And I wonder if you could just talk about that process of how you were able to get, in the New York Times and kind of get pretty good publicity for this.
I will share again my last slide because it's my blog. And I wanted to, it's hard to get in the New York Times. I just negotiated yesterday, the negotiation ended, another piece. And of course, it was being modified to the point where it's going to lose its messaging. So I'm taking it elsewhere. But you build a relationship with these editors. And it's hard work. A lot of it has to do with who knows who to be able to get into the door. But to be honest with you, although there is a kind of a discriminatory approach historically to mainstream media in the US, mainly covering the Palestinian affairs, that is changing. Today, when you see, for example, on the front page of the New York Times, the pictures of 30 or 40 young kids in Gaza who were killed in the latest Israeli onslaught, the one before the last, that's bold coverage, especially for the New York Times, but they did it because they see that times are changing. Polls are coming out indicating, for example, that the Democratic Party, the constituents of the Democratic Party, are fully aligned with the Palestinian rights and the need to end the occupation, unlike the leadership of the Democratic Party. So that contention is allowing mainstream media to start to pick up more and more on the Palestinian narrative. If you look in the Foreign Affairs magazine, if you look in The Nation, you're going to see a lot of coverage more recently than you did before, but it's hard work. While I'm on this point, this picture is a picture of my blog. It's very simple. It's not a sexy blog, but it has a lot of information on it. Here you will find all my social media links. Feel free to connect with me. I'd love to stay in touch. I'm one of 12 Palestinians worldwide that will reply to your email on the same day. On the From Sam's desk, you will find all my writings in reverse chronological order. So if you want to know my latest writings, you can find them here. I have recommended readings and recommended documentaries. On the recommended readings, there's one in specific that I start with that you'll see when you click on it, is a book by a colleague of mine. Her name is Fida Jirius. She's a Christian Palestinian Israeli citizen who wrote her history of her family's narrative. And she talks about the history of the Palestinian people over the last 100 years. If you're looking for one book that gives you a full Palestine read, it would be her book. It's called Stranger. It's titled Stranger in My Own Land. A very powerful book. And there's others there as well. In documentaries, you will find what you noted earlier, which is the Boycott film, but you'll find many other ones as well. A lot of them are Israeli-produced documentaries, especially about how the settler movement was created. You'll find a lot of information there. And every once in a while, when I get really frustrated and I feel the world needs to know something that it should already know, I issue a post which is coined For the Record. And if you go to For the Record, you'll find a lot of these tidbits of things that I think the international community should be reminded of. And I would be more than glad to stay in touch with anybody who would like to continue the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sam. Everyone is saying in the chat, thank you so much. This was incredibly informative. People also commended you on your balance of tone and your viewpoint, which was really great. So yeah, as I said at the beginning, we have been recording this. We thank everyone who was able to join us on this Saturday live, and we will also be sharing the recording with everyone who wasn't able to join live, and we'll also be posting it to World Beyond War's YouTube channel and sharing it on our social media channels. And with that, I want to pass it back to Larry to close us out. Oh, Larry, you're muted.
Sam, I want to thank you for taking the time at a very different hour than ours, and for your preparation with your PowerPoints, which were very effective. And I want to thank you for your efforts. Like you said, it is hard work. And those of us here who want to be supportive and get the word out, I think collectively throughout the country here with the various organizations, we are able to reach out to more people. And that's what we do. I communicate daily with a local newspaper in Maine, and I just share articles. But I want to thank you. And also, I know Al Mitty and I are planning on going to Palestine next April or May, and we would love to connect with you when we are there.
For sure.
So we look forward to seeing you again in person. And we thank you for your efforts, your hard work, your persistence, your steadfastness, your loyalty to your efforts and the efforts of so many people. So we thank you.
Thank you as well. And I want to thank many of the people who I know on this call. I know the pictures are not showing, but I know the names. These are colleagues, many of them, and a lot of them have supported my work, and I appreciate that from them. And it's really important what you're doing as three organizations, bringing Palestine to the visible forefront in the US is key today, because it's about education. The more Americans see what's happening here, I believe they'll reach their own conclusions and first fix their own political system, and then hopefully that will help us.
So yes, and like Greta said, the recording will go out to the many more who had registered, and we told them that if you can't make it at this time, the recording will go out, so they'll get the message.
Thanks a lot. Great to see everyone. Bye-bye.
Great, thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.